Hello everyone, welcome to the first episode of Digital Deck Builders. For some of you, this is not the first video of mine you've seen. I have a few other good video game compilations I record every other week, so check those out if that interests you. For this week's episode of Digital Deck Builders, we'll be looking at the first deck I ever built way back at the start of Ixalan Block. It's a tribal dinosaur deck with Gishath, Sun's Avatar, as the commander. The history of this deck goes back to the very first Magic pack I ever opened in October 2017. It was an Ixalan pack, and I managed to pull Gishath, Sun's Avatar as my very first mythic. Talk about lucky, huh? I built a standard deck around it back in the day, but as I was introduced by my friend later that month to Commander, I instantly set to work on my very first deck, destroying the standard deck completely. This deck has evolved over time, but is finally settled as a two-theme deck. Tribal dinosaurs as the main theme, and Voltron as the sub-theme. In this video, I'll go over the main goal of the themes of this deck, the way it ramps, how it draws cards, alongside its abilities to recur and tutor, and finally, the mana base. First off, let's have a look at the commander, Gishath, Sun's Avatar. Gishath, Sun's Avatar is a legendary dinosaur avatar creature that costs 5 generic mana and Naya to cast, with the evergreen keyword abilities Trample, allowing for some pretty decent evasion, Vigilance, so it can defend the player after attacking, and Haste, so it can make an impact on the board the turn it's brought into play. Gishath also has a triggered ability that occurs whenever it deals combat damage to a player, revealing that many cards from the top of your library. If any of the revealed cards are dinosaurs, you may put them onto the battlefield and put any other cards revealed this way at the bottom of your library. In my current version of the deck, I have split the theme of the deck into two, Tribal Dinosaur and Voltron. The main theme, Tribal Dinosaur, relies on Gishath's triggered ability going off and us cheating as many powerful dinosaurs into play as we can. First up, for our Tribal Dinosaur cards, is Yadaro, Wandering Monster, an 8/8 legendary dinosaur turtle creature with Trample and Haste. He costs 5 generic mana and 2 red mana to be cast, but he can be cycled for generic mana and a red up to 4 times, which shuffles him into your library instead of the graveyard. On the 4th time, you can put Yadaro onto the battlefield instead. Next up is Galta, Primal Hunker, a 12/12 legendary elder dinosaur creature with Trample. It costs 10 generic mana and 2 green mana. Also costs X less, where X is the total power among creatures you control. Goring Ceratops is more of a team player than the last two heavy hitters, coming in as a 3/3 dinosaur creature for 5 generic and 2 white mana. It has double strike, and when it attacks, all other attacking creatures gain double strike until the end of turn. With a few good heavy hitters out, swinging with this dinosaur is quite often fatal. Another incredible heavy hitter for the tribe is Zitalpala, Primal Dawn, a 4/8 legendary elder dinosaur creature that costs 6 generic and 2 white mana to cast. It also has an Acroma-like host of abilities including Flying, Double Strike, Vigilance, Trample, and Indestructible. For the next dinosaur, the Awakening Sun's Avatar, a 7/7 that costs 5 generic and 3 white, with the ability on cast to destroy all non-dinosaur creatures. While the cost is heavy for the effect, destroying all of our opponent's boards while getting a 7/7 is an awesome ability that can change the tide of the game. Next up is Itali, Primal Storm, a chaotic 6/6 legendary elder dinosaur creature that costs 4 generic and 2 red, with the attack triggered ability, which allows you to cast the top card of each player's library until end of turn for free. This ability even going off once can really change up the game, or you'll end up getting 4 lands off the top of everyone's libraries. It's powerful, but unreliable. A little more of a reliable heavy hitter, Rampaging Brontodon is a 7/7 dinosaur creature that comes in for 5 generic and 2 green mana. It has Trample and the triggered ability that when it attacks, it gets +1/+1 for each land you control. meaning that it will usually be a 12/12 or bigger when it attacks. Another wonderful piece of board management is the Apex Altosaur, a 10/10 dinosaur creature that costs 7 generic and 2 green mana. When it enters, it fights up to one target creature you don't control, and then has an Enrage ability that has it fight another creature, which leads to it fighting basically every creature that you don't control on the board. Pair this guy up with some Indestructible, and your opponent's creatures become prehistoric chow real quick. So this is a pretty unique dinosaur, one that came out recently in Ikoria. The Coarsewood Crasher comes in for 2 generic and 2 red, and 1 green mana. It has Trample and a triggered ability that triggers whenever combat damage is dealt to a player, creating an XX dinosaur creature with Trample, where X is the total damage dealt to that player this turn. This has the ability to go off up to 3 times in a turn, which is a pretty good value engine for the cost of 5 mana. Next up is the deck's main source of life gain, the Verdant Suns avatar. It's a 5/5 dinosaur avatar creature that comes in for 5 generic and 2 green mana, and has the triggered ability of whenever it or another creature enters the battlefield under your control, you gain life equal to its toughness. A great dinosaur to protect our other dinosaurs is the Temple Altosaur, a 3/4 dinosaur creature which comes in for 4 generic and 1 white mana, with the triggered ability of reducing any single instance of damage to our dinosaurs to 1. This protects our creatures when blocking, swinging, and with damage-based board wipes like Blasphemous Act. More of an investment than a dinosaur, the Terrarian Mauler is a 2/3 shapeshifter creature that comes in for 2 generic and a red mana. It has the Changeling ability, allowing it to be all creature types, and when an opponent casts a spell, you may put a +1/+1 counter on the Mauler. Definitely a good creature against Spellslinger decks. A great support dinosaur to join our lineup is Regisaur Alpha, a 4/4 dinosaur creature that costs 3 generic and a Gruul mana to come into play. This creature is great as it gives all other dinosaurs we control haste, alongside creating a 3/3 dinosaur creature with trample when it enters. This allows for an immediate impact on the board while supporting all of our other dinosaurs without haste in the deck. And finally, more of a pet card than anything else, is Zalortha, Strength Incarnate. While he does give our commander an additional toughness, Zalortha shines more so as a 3 generic and 1 Gruul 7/3 with trample. In the support category for this theme is first up Rhythm of the Wild, an enchantment that comes in for generic mana and Gruul, makes all of your creatures' spells unable to be countered, and gives non-token creatures you control Riot, an ability that gives creatures haste or a +1/+1 counter on entry. Making sure our creatures can make an impact the turn they enter play is very important, especially in a deck like ours which has a higher mana curve. So, giving them haste and protecting them on cast with Rhythm of the Wild can save us a lot of time and heartache down the road. And as a finisher for really sealing up the game is War Storm Surge. War Storm Surge is an enchantment that comes in for 5 generic and a red mana that has an ability which triggers anytime a creature enters the battlefield. That ability is, whenever a creature enters the battlefield, it deals damage equal to its power to any target. Whenever we cast or cheat in big dinosaurs with Gishath, this will trigger, dealing damage to any target. Our secondary theme and smaller set of cards is Voltron, of course. Not only do we need to get him through to our opponents to get our free dinosaurs, Gishath also has a power of 7, meaning 3 hits from him will take out an opponent. Our Voltron strategy here is to gain more value from our attacks, protect him from other creatures, and get him through. First up is Strionic Resonator, an artifact that comes in for 2 generic, and you may pay 2 generic mana and tap it to copy target triggered ability you control. If Gishath deals combat damage, you can go from revealing the top 7 cards of your library to the top 14. The potential to get more dinosaurs is incredible with this card, and for the mana it takes to cast it, it can accelerate your board state quite nicely. Next up is the Bear Umbra, an enchantment aura for 2 generic and 2 green mana. The Bear Umbra has 3 buffs. It gives +2/+2 to your creature, untaps all lands you control when the enchanted creature attacks, and has Totem Armor, an ability that regenerates your creature if it would die, destroying the aura instead. Another great card, which I admit I stumbled upon at a garage sale, is Riding the Dealu Horse, a sorcery speed buff that comes in for 2 generic and 1 green, which permanently gives any target creature +2/+2 and the evasion ability Horsemanship, which makes it unblockable to any creature without Horsemanship. Between the permanency of this effect and the fact that Horsemanship is a very old evasion ability, this card is incredible in the way that it's just an upgrade target creature on a stick. Another wonderful card for evasion is the enchantment aura Spirit Mantle, which costs 1 generic and 1 white mana. It gives the enchanted creature protection from creatures and +1/+1, which in reality is strictly better than unblockable, as it protects our creature from any abilities that our opponent's creatures have, on top of preventing our creature from being blocked. And finally, we have Tamir Battle Rage, an instant for 1 generic and 1 red mana. On cast, you may have it give a single creature double strike until end of turn, and give it trample if it has power 4 or greater. Hitting an opponent once early on in the game with Gishath and then taking them out with this card later on is amazing. Your opponent may not want to block and believe they can take the hit, but with this, you can take advantage of that mistake. Now on to the ramp. There is a lot more ramp in this deck than others, as we have to fight a bigger mana curve than most due to our high cost creatures and high cost spells. We'll start off with the turn 1 ramp spells, anything that ramps us or sets us up to ramp on the first turn. First up, there's Font of Fertility, an enchantment that comes in for 1 green mana and with the ability to sacrifice it for 1 generic and 1 green mana, to tutor your library for a basic land and put it into play tapped. This is a great card and it's very overlooked. I've not seen it in a lot of other deck techs and it does a lot for the cost. It's literally just a Wayfarer's Bauble, a now $3.50 card for 20 cents. It's a great pickup. I advise it for anyone who runs green in their decks. Another great ramp spell is Soul Ring, an artifact which comes in for 1, tapping for 2 colorless mana. This is often debated to be a commander staple, and in my opinion for decks with higher mana curves, I agree with that sentiment. Ramping us by 2 mana on turn 1 is incredible, with the ability to ramp us into more mana rocks on the same turn. Alongside that, we have a great mana dork to fix your mana, Birds of Paradise.
Look at that art!
This is an infamous Magic card with a history starting all the way back in the first set of Magic Alpha. Birds of Paradise is a bird creature with flying that comes in for a single green mana and taps for 1 mana of any color. And finally, the weakest, but still a helpful turn 1 mana rock is Pyramid of the Pantheon. While it fixes your mana and can become a Gilded Lotus essentially, it can also be a very big target. I've had my fair share of games where the turn I upgrade it fully, it's destroyed at the end of turn. Those were some pretty depressing games, I'll tell you. Now let's take a look at all the artifact ramp we have. First up, we have Chromatic Lantern, which comes in for 3 generic and gives all of our lands the ability to tap for any color of mana, instantly fixing our mana. Not to mention, it is itself a mana rock, tapping for 1 mana of any color. I'm also running all the talismans in Naya, which essentially tap for 2 of any of our commander's colors at the cost of a life, or for a colorless. These are great turn 2 ramp artifacts, fixing the mana for this deck and ramping it ahead. In addition to the Talisman series, I also run Star Compass and Thematic Compass. Why do I need 2 compasses? I have a pretty good sense of direction. Unless it's trying to steal my free will. Just maybe. Star Compass comes in tapped for 2 generic, but taps for 1 mana of any color, making it a pretty decent mana rock. Thematic Compass also comes in for 2 generic, but has an activated ability that you can pay 3 generic mana into and search your library for any basic land and put it into your hand. With this in play, you can make sure you never miss a land drop, in addition to the fact it transforms into a better maze of it when you have 7 or more lands in play. Finally, we have Thran Dynamo, which pretty much pays for itself as it comes in for 4 generic mana and taps for 3 colorless. This is excellent for getting Gishath out on the same turn as it comes into play. As for land ramp, we'll start off with the classic Secura Tribe Elder, or as many call him, Steve, a snake shaman creature which comes in for 1 generic and 1 green mana, with the ability to sacrifice it and search for a basic land card and put it into play tapped. This is good for blocking on early turns and then sacrificing it in response. Next up, we have the classic Rampant Growth, which comes in for 1 generic and a green mana to ramp us by 1 basic land card and putting it into play tapped. Another great source of ramp is actually one of our dinosaurs, Ranging Raptors. Ranging Raptors is a 2/3 dinosaur creature which comes in for 2 generic and 1 green. Good for blocking on early turns, the Raptors have Enrage. When this creature is dealt damage, search your library for a basic land card and put it into play, tapped. Up next, we have Cultivate, a commander favorite, a sorcery for 2 generic and 1 green mana, which will ramp you for 2 basic lands, one going into the hand and the other on the battlefield tapped. For a little more mana, we have the upgraded version, Circuitous Route, which searches our library for a basic land or gate card and then puts them into play tapped. For another mana, we have the upgraded version of Circuitous Route with Grow from the Ashes, a sorcery spell for 2 generic and a green mana that searches our library for a basic land card and puts it into the battlefield tapped. However, if you pay its kicker cost, 2 generic mana, it will put 2 into play untapped instead of just 1. Now with all that out of the way, we have our mana support cards. First up, we have 3 mana cost reducers for our creatures in this deck. Kinyatli's Caller, the first of the 3, is a 0/3 that comes in for a single white mana and reduces our dinosaur spells by 1 generic mana. Next up is Marauding Raptor, which comes in for 1 generic and a red mana, reducing our creature spells by 1 generic mana, but also damages them on their entry. Our last mana cost reducer is Nylea, Keen-Eyed, a legendary enchantment god creature. She comes in for 3 generic and a green mana, and is a 5/6 that has Indestructible. She also is not a creature unless you have Devotion to green less than 5. Nylea reduces the costs of your creature spells by 1 and is a great mana sink, as you can pay 2 generic and a green mana with her and reveal the top card of your library and put it into your hand if it's a creature. Otherwise, you can put it into the graveyard. For land support, we have first the Wayward Swordtooth, a 5/5 that comes in for 2 generic and a green mana that allows you to play an additional land on each turn, but can't attack or block unless you have the City's Blessing. In addition, we also have the Growing Rites of Itlamok, a legendary enchantment for 2 generic and a green mana, which reveals the top 4 cards of our library on entry, letting us put a creature into our hand and the rest at the bottom of our library. When you have 4 or more creatures at the end step, it transforms into Itlamok, Cradle of the Sun, basically a better Gaia's Cradle. Finally, we have our land mana doublers, Mirari's Wake and Regal Behemoth. Mirari's Wake is an enchantment for 3 generic and Selesnya mana, and gives your creatures +1/+1 and adds an additional mana to your mana pool anytime you tap a land. Regal Behemoth is a 5/5 dinosaur creature with trample and comes in for 4 generic and 2 green mana. When it enters the battlefield, you become the monarch, and as long as you are the monarch, your land's tapped for an additional mana. Also, at your end step, you draw an additional card. Speaking of card draw, time for the deck's card draw. Most of our card draw is green, with the exception of Thrill of Possibility, just in case we don't have enough green available for our other spells. Thrill of Possibility is an instant for 1 generic and a red mana. It has an additional cost of discarding a card when we cast it, but allows us to draw 2 cards. Next up is the instant Return of the Wild Speaker, a modal spell that costs 4 generic and a green mana, and has 2 modes. The first mode is draw cards equal to the greatest power among non-human creatures you control. Easily, this will be drawing us 5 cards most of the time, and 7 with our commander out. It also has a slightly less relevant ability of pumping non-human creatures by +3/+3 until end of turn. The last of our one-off draw spells is Rishkar's Expertise, which costs 4 generic and 2 green mana. It's going to draw us cards equal to, again, the greatest power among creatures we control, and allows us to cast 1 card with mana cost 5 or less from our hand without paying that cost. That could easily be a free Mirari's Wake, so in my mind, this is a fantastic spell. Our other 2 draw card spells are more permanent and interactive with our creatures. Our first is the Great Henge, a legendary artifact that costs 7 generic and 2 green mana, where X is the greatest power among creatures you control. It functions firstly as a mana rock, adding 2 green mana to your mana pool and gaining you 2 life when you tap it. However, the most important part of this artifact lies in the fact that anytime a non-token creature enters the battlefield under your control, you draw a card and put a +1/+1 counter on that creature. This is an excellent way to draw cards in the mid-game, especially after an attack by Gishath. Next up is the best card in the deck, in my opinion, Garruk's Uprising. A great draw card enchantment that costs 2 generic and 1 green mana to cast. When it comes into play, if you control a creature with power 4 or greater, draw a card. And anytime a creature with power 4 or greater enters the battlefield under your control, you get to draw a card too. Not to mention, your creatures gain trample with this enchantment. This card replaces itself on entry and has the ability to immediately impact the board by giving our creatures trample, making itself, in my opinion, the best card in this deck. Speaking of immediately impacting the board, we also have a lot of interaction to keep up with our lower mana curve opponents. First off, we have the board wipes Day of Judgment and Winds of Abandon. Day of Judgment is a sorcery for 2 generic and 2 white mana, and it destroys all creatures. A lot of times we'll be completely set up ramp-wise, but our opponents may be a bit ahead. With a low-cost board wipe like Day of Judgment, we could possibly even cast Gishath afterwards, or another important spell. Another great way to wipe the board is Winds of Abandon, a sorcery spell for 1 generic and 1 white that exiles target creature you don't control, and then the player who controlled that creature goes and searches their library for a basic land and puts it into play tapped. It can also be overloaded for 4 generic and 2 white mana, exiling all of our opponent's creatures but none of ours. This is a great spell for clearing the board when our opponents have their best creatures out. Taking them out permanently is a huge upside and will usually pave the way for victory. We also have plenty of targeted removal, starting off with Nature's Way, a sorcery spell for 1 generic and 1 green mana that gives target creature we control vigilance and trample until end of turn, and has that creature deal damage equal to its power to target creature we don't control. Next up is Swords to Plowshares, an excellent 1 white mana instant removal spell. It exiles target creature and its controller gains life equal to its power. Giving an opponent life to exile one of their best creatures, in my opinion, is always an amazing trade. For our next piece of interaction, we have Beast Within, an instant that costs 2 generic and 1 green, a great cost for destroying any target permanent,
giving that permanent's controller a 3/3 beast.
Another really good card for targeted removal is Decimate. I've heard a bit of ill will towards Decimate, but I only have praise for this card. Destroying an artifact, creature, enchantment, and land, all for 2 generic and a Gruul mana, is an amazing rate. This card can really level the power balance of the table back into neutral, or even on your terms if your opponents are ahead. Up next is Return to Dust, an instant speed removal spell that costs 2 generic and 2 white mana. It exiles target artifact or enchantment from the game. If it's your main phase, you can exile 2 such permanents instead. Finally, we have a legendary Elder Dinosaur creature for this slot, Zitalpala, Primal Calamity. He costs 6 generic and 1 Naya mana to come into play and is a 9/9 with Vigilance, Reach, and Trample. While we do like to get our dinosaurs free with Gishath, Zitalpala is often better off being cast, as when he is, you untap all lands you control. In addition to his already absurd stats and abilities, Zitalpala has 3 activated abilities, 1 for each color in Naya. For 2 generic and a red mana, Zitalpala deals 3 damage to any target creature. For 2 generic and a green mana, you may destroy target artifact or enchantment. For 2 generic and a white mana, you gain 3 life. When Zitalpala comes into play, that usually means that all of the artifacts and enchantments that aren't yours will be taking a stroll over to the graveyard quite soon. A really impressive and not to be ignored late game threat for sure. Next up, we have some oppressive interaction with Bonds of Mortality, an enchantment for 1 generic and a green mana that cantrips, alongside having the ability for you to pay 1 green to make your opponent's creatures lose hexproof and indestructible. More often than not, hexproof and indestructible can be an issue in games, and being able to remove it on command can come in handy. Up next is our last dinosaur, Kinyali Sunwing, a 2/3 dinosaur creature with flying and the ability that forces our opponent's creatures to enter the battlefield tapped. Slowing our opponents down while adding to our board is incredibly powerful. And while I wouldn't want this to be the only thing I reveal with a Gishath attack, it is still an important card to the deck. For our last enchantment, we have War Cadence, a bit of an underrated card from Mercadian Masks. It comes in for 2 generic and a red mana, and by paying X and a red into its activated ability, it makes it so that creatures cannot block this turn without paying X for each blocking creature. In the late game, or even the mid game, having this down with a host of our powerful dinosaurs forces our opponents to only block with 1 or 2 creatures at best, and none if we pay high enough. Now we have some of our preventative interaction with Heroic Intervention and Boros Charm. Heroic Intervention is an instant for a generic and a green mana that gives your permanents indestructible and hexproof until end of turn. As a great way to protect against board wipes or massive targeted removal, Heroic Intervention has found its place in the deck for sure. Up next, we have Boros Charm, a modal spell that gives you 3 options. Deal 4 damage to target player, give your permanents indestructible until the end of turn, or a creature you control gains double strike until the end of turn. It is a really great spell, and while I don't often use the other modes besides giving my permanents indestructible, I have killed someone by using Boros Charm as a burn spell. It was a very salty but satisfying game, that's for sure. The last of our interaction closes up with some modal spells that have a lot of things to do. First up is Dromoka's Command, an instant for Selesnya that has you choose 2. 1. Prevent all damage target instant or sorcery would deal this turn. 2. Target player sacrifices an enchantment. 3. Put a +1/+1 counter on a target creature. Or 4. Target creature you control fights target creature you don't control. Lastly is Naya Charm, a great instant for Naya that deals 3 damage to target creature, or return a card from the graveyard back to an owner's hand, or tap all creatures target player controls. Now with our interaction out of the way, let's move on to our tutors and our recursion. For our first recursion spell, we'll be running Road of Return, a sorcery for 2 green mana, which is a modal spell that allows us to choose 1 or 2, or entwine the 2 options for 2 generic mana. The first option is return target permanent card from our graveyard to our hand, or 2, put our commander into our hand from the command zone. The second ability is the most relevant ability in my opinion, as being able to put your commander into your hand helps avoid high commander tax and certain effects like the newly printed Dranith Magistrate. Up next, we have a powerful one-time spell with Praetor's Council, a sorcery for 5 generic and 3 green mana. It returns all the cards from your graveyard to your hand and gives you no maximum hand size for the rest of the game. You do have to exile it afterwards, but after a long game, returning all of your best cards that have died to removal back to your hand is an amazing effect. Not to mention the fact that you now have no maximum hand size permanently. Now on to the tutors. First up, we have Forerunner of the Empire, a 1/3 human soldier creature that comes in for 3 generic and a red mana. When it enters the battlefield, you may search your library for a dinosaur card, reveal it, and put it on top of your library. It also has a second ability that deals 1 damage to each creature whenever a dinosaur enters the battlefield under your control. Tutoring for and then possibly even drawing Zekama with this card on the same turn can really set us up to win, as we get to untap all of our lands and then move on to manage the board in our favor. Not to mention the second ability activates any of our Enrage abilities. For our last tutor and non-land card, we have the great finisher Finale of Devastation. For 2 green mana and X generic mana, we can search our library for a creature card with converted mana cost X or less and put it into play. If X is 10 or more, creatures we control gain +X/+X and haste until end of turn, ensuring we can attack with literally everything. Lastly, we have the mana base. We'll be running 32 lands in this deck, 9 non-basics and 23 basics. For the first 3 basics, we'll be running Unclaimed Territory, a tribal land that adds 1 mana of any color that can be used for the chosen creature type. Cavern of Souls is a similar tribal land that also adds only 1 mana of any color that can be used for the chosen creature type, but with the added bonus that it makes spells of that type unable to be countered. Fabled Passage is a tutor sacrifice land that searches your library for any basic land and puts it into play tapped unless you control 4 or more lands. Up next is Stomping Ground, a dual land that taps for Gruul, but only comes in untapped if you play 2 life. Another dual land is Rootbound Crag, that enters untapped only if you control a mountain or a forest. And finally, Sun-Baked Canyon, a Boros dual land that taps for red or white, but only if you pay 1 life. It also has an activated ability that allows you to pay 1 generic mana and sacrifice the land to draw a card. Our last 3 non-basic lands are, first, Command Tower, a must-have, in my opinion, in 2 color decks and up. It taps for any colors in your commander's color identity. Mana Confluence, which you can pay a life and tap to add 1 mana of any color to your mana pool. And then finally, Reliquary Tower, a land that taps for colorless but gives you no maximum hand size as long as it's in play. For the rest of our lands, we'll be running 11 forests, 6 mountains, and 6 plains. And that wraps it up for this episode of Digital Deck Builders. Let me know if you've built a Gishath deck or plan to make one, and what you have done or would have done different here. Also, make sure to like and subscribe if you liked my video, so YouTube will know to share it with others. Thank you for watching, and peace.